Nice to be back in Cambridge. Just wish the U's would be doing a bit better at the moment. I'll start by explaining a bit how the book came to be written. It's going to be my last book, I think, because they're ever such a faff to get finished, especially a fiddly one like this with lots of illustrations. And also, I retired finally in August, so I think I'm going to enjoy my retirement. I wanted to write a book about all the interesting working class objects that I'd seen working in museums for 30 years. The issue with museums is that it's all a bit transitory. Your ability to give information to visitors is quite fleeting, so things don't get written down. And there's so much still just in my brain about these objects, and I thought it would be really good to have a good illustrated book talking about working class things. And generally the things made often by working class people themselves, and it also covers quite a long time span, so it could incorporate all of that. And it looks at not just things with to do with the labour movement. It looks at things that came out of the working class experience over what we historians call the long 19th century. So it's not just about the Labour Party. Now, that was fine, but to get a book like that off the ground needed quite an academic cutting edge, because art historians have used objects in historical discussion for, for centuries. That's their stock in trade. But historians haven't used objects and haven't used visual material very much. So it needed a kind of intellectual stance to discuss that, and also to become a how-to-do-it manual. What's the best way of using objects when you're talking about history? Now, I knew I wasn't the person to write that, because I tend to be, I know about the stuff. I'm not a great intellect about history itself. So I recruited a friend and colleague, Martin Wright, who's at Cardiff, to do that bit of the book, to do what I think is the hard bit, and I'll do the easy one. So 3 years later, it happened. Now, I'm not going to bore you too much with this. I've got a few copies to sell if you take it away. This is a sort of, I suppose, a how-to read the first chapter. This is Martin's intellectual first chapter, which is called Understanding Labour Things. I'll read it out. This defines and explores the key themes of the work. It asks exactly what we mean when we discuss labour and things, both elastic terms which are rarely defined. It provides an overview of the historiography, that is what other people have written, of materiality and the way in which it impinges upon labour history. It also explores, through a close study of primary sources, the ways in which working people related to material and visual culture, both as individual and collectively through the labour movement. and it assesses the importance of material objects and images to the labour movement, and examines the ways in which material and visual cultures help the movement to communicate its values and ideals. Right, that's the lesson over. The second chapter is the easiest one, and it is about objects and images, and it's divided into 5 sections which explore the main themes in working class history in the 19th century. And again, I'll read you out roughly what each section is. The first section looks at early trade unions and the emergence of early trade societies, beg your pardon, and the emergence of modern trade unions. It includes flags and banners, regalia necessary to the administration of trade unions in a period when governance was developing unevenly and members were forced to operate illegally under a cloak of secrecy. So we start looking at the stuff now. This is the first object. I'm going to show probably about 25 images tonight. There's images of about 100 objects in the book. So this is just a portion of what's there. Picking up on that last point on the last slide, early trade unions, they were called trade societies, that's what they called themselves in the early 19th century, were essentially illegal. They came about during the 18th century almost entirely, to answer your question, not from the new factories, but from workshops. And these were basically handicraft workmen. They were nearly all men and referred to themselves as tradesmen. They had many enemies. They were operating at a time of the Industrial Revolution. They were operating at a time when there was an interest in democracy with the American Revolution and then the French Revolution. So the British ruling class were absolutely scared of revolution in the UK. We can debate whether there was an attempt at revolution in the UK. There may or may not have been. But they clamped down entirely on working class self-governing organisations, which gave quite a disadvantage to the early trade unions, and they operated and had to operate with objects like this. Because they were an illegal organisation, their funds were always at risk. And they needed a box like this to put their money in. It's as simple as that. And there would be a great temptation for working class people who had been elected as an official of the early trade unions. So it's got 2 locks. Therefore, you had to have several union officials present before it was unlocked. And there are lots of stories of early trade union officials running off with the boxes and so forth. This is an extremely interesting box. It's from Ludlow in Shropshire. It's a nice... It could be as early as 1669, this box, because there was this, there had been medieval guilds. They had decayed in most major towns, but in smaller towns like Ludlow, they clung on for a time. Now, the Ludlow tradesmen, there weren't many of them, and in a town like Ludlow, they banded together. So there would be 6 different trades who called themselves the hammermen. And that was because they used a hammer in their trade. These would have been carpenters and such like. There was a second Ludlow trade society called the stitchmen, and that was because they used a needle in their trades, tailors and saddlers and such like. It's only about, you know, a couple of feet by 2 feet, and it's an extremely nice example of something from very early on. The other thing, that's in Shrewsbury Museum collection. This is in the People's History Museum, and it's a skeleton. These were, and it has over the top of it, you can't quite read it, it has "Remember Thy End." They were illegal organisations that had no sanction for members that were minded to spy or give away the secrets of the trade. So what they did was put the fear of God into new members, and they often commissioned a life-size skeleton as part of the early regalia of these societies. Now, this is a skeleton. We don't know the significance of the sun and the moon as an hourglass there. There's a scythe. The skeleton is holding a scythe there. And these things would have been very powerful symbols to early 19th century tradesmen. Now, there were a large number, they were used in all trade unions in the early 19th century. There was a larger number generated when a man called Robert Owen, who's remembered today as the founder of the cooperative movement, but he was also involved in, he was a very interesting man because a very successful entrepreneur. He was a cotton mill owner, came from very humble Welsh background. But he threw his resources, and he was an immensely rich man, into left-wing causes. And one of them was trying to get trade unions to band together in the 1830s. And he formed something called the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union. And this grew enormously and claimed 500,000 members and so forth. But it withered away just as quickly. And the Grand National, as it was known, commissioned hundreds of these skeletons. It's unique. Only one survives. I'll tell you a bit about that in a second. But the Grand National, at the end, was this enormous failure. And moreover, it was a dangerous failure because the most famous part of the Grand National were, of course, the Tolpuddle martyrs, the 6 Dorset farm workers who were rounded up by the local gentry JPs, and they were accused of administering illegal oaths. And the 6 farm workers found themselves on a one-way passage to Australia, being transported. And they were found out because they went to a local sign writers and asked to commission something very like that. And the sign writer informed the magistrates. There's an interesting story how it found its way into the museum, in that there was an email from an antiques dealer in Colorado in the western USA who said, oh, I've just unloaded a skip, not a skip, what do you call them, a container full of antiques I buy from the UK, and I can't see a use for this. Would you be interested? And for the cost of shipping it back again, it's there in the People's History Museum as the back piece to a display about early 19th century trade societies and their ritual and regalia of this period. Now, this is an emblem of the Norwich Plumbers Society. Again, it was almost certainly part of the Grand National, but no records survive at that period. So it's an interesting example of an object that tells us something in the absence of records, understandably because of the illegality. They didn't record their activities. But Owen centred the Grand National on a group of building trade workers from Birmingham, and central to that were the plumbers. Now, the plumbers were a particularly embattled lot because they worked in lead at that period. You can see these things are soldering irons, and these are all the tools of the trade. And lead was poisonous. They had very poor life expectations. Even as 1892, the average age of death of a plumber was 37. And it's a lovely bit of art, naive art, and it shows how the plumbers themselves wanted themselves depicted as very respectable, having this trade, having valuable skills, and they wanted to defend their apprenticeship. They wanted to defend the traditional rate of pay for the job, and so forth. And this hung in a pub, still there, called the Plumber's Arms in Norwich. The other thing to say is they looked back to the old guilds of the City of London. So there's this kind of, we're not fly-by-night organisations. We have a long history, and they adapted the coat of arms from the plumbers. I should have also said I've tried to weave in bits about Cambridge history, because this is UK-wide, and this is something I wrote in 1985 for Cambridgeshire Local History Society, which is about a branch of the Grand National in Cambridge, because there was one. It was of tailors and shoemakers, but it never really took off in a big way. After one meeting, it got reported to the magistrates, and essentially the magistrates closed it down. This is 1834, but it may still be there if you like to track it down. Now, sometimes early trade unions could kind of come out of the woodwork, and this is a very early example. It's believed to be the oldest trade union banner in existence. Again, it's in the People's History Museum. Oh, I should have said that last, the plumber's emblem is in the Grassenhall Museum which is in Norfolk. Tried to do that. Now, probably the oldest banner in the world. Again, it's of handicraft workers, template workers who made everything that today would be made of plastic and so forth. It's a wonderful thing, a wonderful bit of naive art, the all-seeing eye of God. This is very interesting. The Union Jack may be an appeal to say we're actually a loyalist organisation. I'll come on to that in a minute. Hope and justice are the two figures. The stick bundle for strength, all seeing eye of God, as I said before. It's very similar, the Union Jack in the corner, to what you find with military colours of the period. Because in 1821, a lot of these trade societies contained men who had been soldiers in the Napoleonic Wars, and there may be a link there. That's what's so fascinating about this. We don't actually know. We can use conjecture to make valuable suppositions about things. Now, the reason that this kind of put its head above the parapet is that it was commissioned for the coronation procession in Liverpool to welcome George IV, who had been the Prince Regent. The old king died, and they were allowed to do this. What's particularly interesting, it was made by a member. He was called William Dixon, and he was paid 5 shillings for washing a colour. The receipt is still on display in the People's History Museum with this one. 5 shillings is about 15 pence nowadays, it would be, isn't it? Half a crown, we all remember that one. Isn't it? Now, this is an interesting example of the regalia coming above ground. This was, again, a painted emblem of miners, coal miners. This is from Wigan, and again, it tries to show its members as respectable. Here are all the tools of the trade, the coat of arms that they dreamt up to show antiquity. It claims to have been set up in 1568. This is about 1820, but by the 1830s, when trade unions were gradually becoming accepted, and that danger of revolution was disappearing, they used exactly the same iconography. The supporters in respectable dress. There's the same coat of arms. There's the mining scene. You can just see a bell pit there, and it's there. And this was used in this regalia on the other side of the Pennines. This is in Ashover, which is near Chesterfield in Derbyshire. So you know the common iconography was there. Let's move on to the second theme, which is the struggle for political reform. Remember, in the early 19th century, Britain wasn't a democracy as we know today. It was an oligarchy ruled by rich people, and votes bought and sold, rotten boroughs and all this sort of thing. So the Labour movement engaged in the struggle for political reform from the late 18th century up until the passing of the Great Reform Act in 1832. And this section it used objects to assert a public presence and to celebrate and commemorate landmarks in the struggle for political rights. This is an important landmark, which is the Peterloo Massacre in 1819 in Manchester city centre. The death toll attributed to Peterloo goes up all the time. It's around about 19 dead and about 700 seriously injured now. And this specifically is to do with the vast protests that followed the Peterloo Massacre. It comes from Skelmanthorpe in Yorkshire. The little rhymes are very typical of banners of this period. But what's interesting is that there's a symbol here, which is that of the anti-slavery movement. Here's the supplicating black man in chains, am I not a man and brother? This actual bit of iconography originated with Wedgwood pottery, and it's used again in a lovely bit of folk art by these protesters to Peterloo. Going on another decade, this is a banner from lowlands of Scotland, outskirts of Glasgow, and a very uncompromising bit of work. We've got the Cap of Liberty, the French revolutionary symbol, which was widely adopted. And look, they've got pikes there. We're going to take things into our own hands. And the Kirkintilloch weavers were very supportive of direct action. And in the 1832 reform agitation, there was a certain amount of direct action. The centre of Bristol and the centre of Nottingham were burnt down in riots. This decoration there is thought to be a bit of the mechanism of a handloom. These were handloom weavers. They lost their competition keeping pace with machines. They disappeared as an occupational group within a generation. But the Reform Act was passed. The workers had a major part in that agitation, and they thought they got the vote. And when the small print came out, they found they hadn't. It was still very much dependent on property owning rights before votes were given. Now, they didn't know that when they had the great celebration of the Reform Act. There were these enormous festivities all over the country. This is from Duns, which again is in the Scottish Lowlands, and it's a shoemaker's banner. These are, again, a nice bit of doggerel that the battle's won, Britannia's sons are free, and despots tremble at the victory. And a nice pun there, we are all true to the last. Get it? The tools of the trade, St. Crispin's crown, and these aren't the shoemakers themselves. These are the ideal clients for the shoemakers. These are the men's men and the ladies' men, seen out of Jane Austen or what. Now, again, what did this have to do with Cambridge? But One John Brown, who was a radical shoemaker in Cambridge, had been trained in London as a shoemaker, returned to Cambridge, involved in the fringes of the Cato Street conspiracy, which was one of these violent episodes in the 1820s. He returned to Cambridge, involved in various nefarious activities like running a billiard hall, and then became a supporter of the Reform Act and eventually a Liberal councillor. And again, it's something I wrote a few years ago. You also find reform such a big occasion celebrated in domestic art. This is a jug from the Iweni pottery in South Wales. Again, 1832. It could be a christening jug, we've no idea. This is in the collection of Cyfarthfa Castle in Merthyr Tydfil. And you can see the crossed Union Jacks, again, the Union Jack there, and reform emblazoned on it. But we've no idea who Margaret Lewis was. Could have been a christening jug or something like that. But the Iweni pottery in South Wales was producing this stuff and reacting to demand for people that wanted reformed stuff. Now, this is probably my favourite image in the book. It's again connected with reform, but it's a long watercolour of the Shrewsbury Show, which was this annual parade of all the trades in Shrewsbury. There was a political element to it. These were mostly radical supporters of the Reform Act, but there was also a good time element to it. The trades in Shrewsbury had this yearly show. They had little, what were they called, booths in the centre of Shrewsbury, where they sold drink to people who wanted to see the show. And people flocked from miles all over the West Midlands into Shrewsbury. When the railways came, they laid on excursions to the Shrewsbury Show. It all got a bit boozy and sometimes a bit out of control. But this was done by an 11-year-old child. It was a middle-class origin. His father was a bookseller, and eventually he came up to Cambridge and died aged only 20 whilst he was still studying here. And it's likely that he had some neurological condition, autistic spectrum, one might say, that made him not only record this occasion in enormous detail, but he wrote about it as well. There's an accompanying book in the Shrewsbury Museum collection. And again, these are groups of tradesmen. There's about 20 of them. I've just put a few here. These are the painters and plumbers, and each group was led by a member on horseback depicting a figure. And these are the painters and plumbers, led of course by Peter Paul Rubens. Who else? These are the hatters, and they've got a black prince in Hindu style. And here are the tailors, and they're led by Adam and Eve. You can just see them there with the apple tree and the stuffed python one, assume. And they apparently wore leather, what is described as leathern outfits, you know, so it was kind of a nice shade of buff, the coats that they were wearing. But it sounds a great occasion, doesn't it? I'd have loved to have been there. Right, let's move on to a next section. Labour movement, diverse elements, industrial, political, educational, and so forth. And in the 1830s, these combined to form the Chartist movement, which was the world's first working class mass movement, and on an enormous scale. Part of that came from Robert Owen. We mentioned him before. Owen was very outfield. He kind of was a bit away with the fairies in various ways. And he tried to set up these labour exchanges where people would literally be able to work in a labour exchange, and then they would take a banknote you can see with the number of 2 hours, value of 2 hours, and go and spend it in another shop elsewhere. It didn't work out in the long term, and all of Owen's amazing idealism turned to dust. But you know, I think it's easy to scoff at that, because you know, the Industrial Revolution was so new, and who knew where society was going in the early 19th century? It's that imagination of possibilities which is very interesting about Owen. A lot of the movements were more down to earth. Here's the factory reform banner from Huddersfield, of the 10 hours movement. These are factory workers. Factory workers were now involved in the labour movement. Interestingly enough, their leader was a man called Richard Ostler, who was a Tory. He was a Tory land agent, but because the Whigs and the Liberals were going towards a laissez-faire view of the world, where, you know, workers could work all the hours God made, and that was just, you know, supply and demand. Whereas Ostler, as an old-fashioned Tory, didn't think there should be little children in factories working 12-hour days and things like that. The other element, of course, were the trade unions. This is an interesting cast iron plaque made by a member of the Friendly Iron Molders Society. It's an iron version of a printed membership emblem that they would all possess. Some people would say these things are called masterpieces, but there isn't enough of a British tradition to justify that. Masterpieces, you find them in France and Germany, places like that, but not so much in the UK. But they were still interested in making things like this. And it is a wonderful evocation of the skills of the craft, which was central to the values of the early trade societies. The other thing about Chartism is that it had a violent undercurrent, and it was based on a large petition that would be presented and was presented to Parliament. Inevitably, it was turned down by the political establishment, and when that happened, a portion of the Chartist movement resorted to violence. One of the biggest outbreaks was in Newport, Monmouthshire in South Wales, where there was an enormous revolt in 1839. The valleys emptied as workers marched on Monmouth. On Newport, they were tried at Monmouth, it ended in a confrontation with the troops. The troops won, and they left behind all their equipment, muskets, homemade bayonets and things like this. And this is interesting because this is a homemade protective helmet. This is in the collection of Newport Museum. After the Chartists, it all became a bit more quiet. Britain gradually became more prosperous, and the Industrial Revolution's wealth trickled down a bit. And from the late 1850s, the labour movement became dominated by larger craft unions, amalgamated unions. Unions were now not local embattled clubs. They were respectable and national organisations with a bureaucracy. Now, this generation of labour activists has been traditionally viewed negatively by labour historians as servile, and with that became a de-radicalisation of the labour movement. And the period also saw the involvement of respectable working class men in democracy as it developed further from the 1832 Reform Act. Having said that, lots of working class organisations had regalia which looked weird and wonderful. It was backward looking. It looks as if it, was made at a primary school. But these things are wonderful. These are what we think are friendly society poles, probably dated to about 1850. They're stamped iron, painted with these wonderful designs. We don't know who these people were. Many of them are biblical. This could be King David, for example. And again, the moon and sun are prominent. There's about 30 of these things. This is in the People's History Museum collection. So you might be thinking, oh, the labour movement's modernising, but no, they still use stuff like this. This is part of the increase of democracy. There was a further Reform Act in 1867 which gave the vote to essentially urban working class men who were heads of households, but it didn't fall off a Christmas tree. There were tussles to achieve that, and this is a famous one in Hyde Park. There was this monster demonstration in 1866. The government thought it could get away with locking the gates of Hyde Park, which had a fence and gates in those days, and the vast crowd simply tore up the fencing and went inside and had their demonstration. This is a lovely little drawing, almost certainly done by somebody who was a participant. But working class organisations were becoming more respectable. They used membership emblems in a widespread way. It was filled out with the name of the member and proudly displayed in homes. This started with skilled unions, but very rapidly spread to larger unions like miners, or in this case, farm workers. This is a National Agricultural Labourers Union that was set up by this man, Joseph Arch, in the 1870s. But again, the iconography involved the tools of the trade, and you can't see it too well here, but these are the various skills of the members and so forth. Enormous egoist was Joseph Arch. There's a picture of him speaking at the inaugural meeting of the Union in 1872. Um, banners, as we know them, appeared in this period. There are very few painted banners from the 19th century. They're nearly all early 20th century. There's a very particular reason for that, which I won't go into in great detail, except to say that the first generation of trade union banners were built in purposely with built-in obsolescence. So people, unions had to buy another one because they'd take their enormous banner out into the streets, and it got rained on and got split because it had silk. It was made of silk, but had painted panels on it and so forth. Now, there is one exception to that of an early banner, again in the People's History Museum collection, and this is it from Sunderland, but it's an employer's banner. Many of these don't, well, none of them survive. Again, I think it's unique, but it shows the point in the 1870s when there was general agreement on granting a 9-hour day to skilled British workmen. This again was in the early 1870s. And this is probably only used for one occasion, which was the celebration of this granting of the 9-hour day. There's another unexpected side effect of the 9-hour day, and that is, of course, professional football, because up until that period, workers would work all day Saturday. They now finish at midday on a Saturday. What did they do on a Saturday afternoon? They went and watched football. And now, posters. There's a lot in the book about posters. I'm not going to talk a lot about that tonight. But this is an early surviving poster. It's for the Liberal Party. And look at the detail on it. You know, Labour isn't working, or, you know, devil eyes, it ain't. This is, you know, very, very didactic, isn't it? And the hero is Gladstone there. This is his famous Midlothian campaign of speeches. It's comparing him favourably to Robert Burns. And in contrast, that's this effete toff, Disraeli. There's all Disraeli's mistakes, all these foreign wars he set off and so forth. And look at the appalling racism in the way his supporters are depicted. There's, I mean, Disraeli came from partly a Jewish background himself, and look, this could be Nazi Germany, couldn't it? And the Irishman as well. But this was what was expected of political posters in 1880. It got more sophisticated later on. But it was appealing to these respectable working class men that now had the vote. And both the Liberals and Conservatives vied with each other. Another local aspect, Sturton Town Hall, 1882, and it was precisely that sort of audience that this was built for. The kinema, some of us remember that, but interestingly enough, the first socialist meeting in Cambridge, 1892, I think, Ben Tillett, who was one of the Dockers leaders, spoke. So it had to do with Cambridge as well. The British economy faced problems from the 1870s. New ideas, broadly under the term socialism, came about. And that's the next section that the book explores. This is a lovely photograph of William Morris. William Morris, the designer, socialist activist. And this is his own society, the Hammersmith Socialist Society, one of their meetings in 1881. And this banner is also in the book, and it faces the same page. This old fella here is of particular interest. I've written about him a bit. His name was E.T. Craig, Edward Craig. He was a Mancunian by birth, and his life story encompasses the whole of the labour movement in the 19th century. As a boy, he saw the Luddites being imprisoned at Lancaster Castle. He was a participant in the Peterloo Massacre. He was active in Robert Owen's Grand National. He was involved in cooperation all his life, and still in 1891 the old fellow was wheeled out to socialist meetings. One of Owen's interests was phrenology, reading bumps on the head to denote character. And E.T. Craig, at one meeting of the Hammersmith Socialist Society, read the bumps on George Bernard Shaw's head. This is what we think of as a typical trade union banner. This is just a late 1890s one. This is the Ipswich Dockers Union. It's the nearest one I could find to Cambridge. But of course these are still here today with the Felixstowe docks and so on. Interestingly enough, a swathe of socialist organisations came in this period. This is one of the main ones, the Social Democratic Federation, and these people were using that same iconography of the painted banner and so on. This is Social Democratic Federation, which was broadly equivalent to the Communist Party. But alongside them, you still got traditional, local, non-political organisations. This is the Calby and Reby Pig Club from Lincolnshire. Patronised farm workers keeping pigs in their gardens with the support of local gentry and farmers. This is on the cover of the book. It's a prize object. It encompasses both of those worlds. It's this sort of dressing up. It's this fancy dress, bits of odd regalia that we find in the labour movement. But this was worn at the same time by a man who was an activist in the Farm Workers Union and was on their national executive and so forth. So, you know, the old world and the new world could be in the same object and in the same man.
Whereabouts is that? Where's that kept?
It comes from Norfolk, this. It's in the Gresham Hall collection again. There's a lot about it in the book if you're interested. Right, the last section is about the rise of the Labour Party, 1920, 1900 to 1930. And a new tradition in banners came in that period, made by the members themselves, imbued with the ideals of the arts and crafts movement, William Morris and so forth. This was made in Merthyr Tydfil, South Wales. It was actually made by the MP for Merthyr, a man called Bob Wallhead, who was a skilled painter and decorator himself, and he made this with the help of his daughters. I interviewed one of his daughters. We don't know who made this. It was at the Socialist Sunday School, which is like a secular socialist youth organisation, both 1920s. Just so you know, we're in Cambridge. Paternalism still went on. This is a Trinity College kitchen used by this man here, Charles Crouch, and he wasn't paid very much, but he was allowed to take home this full filled with beef dripping for his family. And after he died, his widow used to was allowed to go and get a weekly dole from the Trinity College kitchens. And not just labour organisations, conservative organisations had a mass presence, particularly in something called the Primrose League, which was mainly geared towards women, named of course after Disraeli's favourite flower. This is a banner of the Stretford Manchester Primrose League, and this is a bit out of focus that, but this is the Primrose League membership brooch of Charles Crouch's widow. This may be going to the Museum of Cambridge in due course, but they're dragging their feet on it a bit at the moment. And the involvement of the state. We haven't talked about that very much, but in the Edwardian period, a huge area of importance to working class activities. The reforming Liberal government before the First World War, when Winston Churchill was a Liberal and Lloyd George introduced his People's Budget, Churchill was in charge of labour exchanges. First World War, enormously important. The labour movement, mostly patriotic, mostly involved with the war effort. This is a banner, a stevedores banner from London. You can't see the detail, but it's a war memorial trade union banner. These are the dead of each branch recorded there, and a recruiting meeting in the First World War. Nothing unusual about that, you might say, but this man was the General Secretary of the Navvies Union, a man called John Ward, who was also the Labour MP for Stoke, and there he's leading a group of his members, and he was commissioned by Lord Kitchener as a colonel and led them off to war. Lovely banner, my favourite banner, Farm Workers banner, beautiful art nouveau sort of design, probably made by, this is Norfolk again, probably by a student or a lecturer at Norwich School of Art. We know very little about it. Okay, we're nearly at the end. There's a third chapter, which I wrote, rather than Martin, which is about the preservation, collections, curation and conservation of objects. It looks at that slightly fraught relationship between working class people and museums. It looks at worker collections, and it deals with the development of the main British labour history collections, and looks at the current issues all around that. There's a fourth chapter, which is like a directory of where you can go and see this sort of working class material. It's a short directory, but well, it's compared with other chapters, but there's still a lot of interesting material, not just in those main centres like the People's History Museum. It's spread all round. Sorry, I've gone on slightly longer than I intended. That's it. Thank you.
The Friendly Society poll caps.
Yeah.
Did they take those out on marches?
Yes, they were wooden sticks with that on the end.
And you said you've got about 15 or so?
Well, there's many more in the museum collection, but though that particular type, which were handmade and clearly, you know, intended for an interesting purpose. Yes, I think there's between 30 and 40 of those, but there were bigger national friendly societies, and you could buy commercially wooden turned staves and things like this, but they were very, you see any early 19th century working class procession, the drawing of the Shrewsbury show, they've all got staves there, and so forth. It was something that was expected. There's lots of them around.
So I was just going to say, Monroe, you've got the big, Monroe Cemetery's got Edward Coulson, who led the Bricklayers Society for 30 years, president of the TUC in 1865.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I was going to ask, why were the trade unions so underground, given the guilds have been so prolific for so many centuries?
Well, I think the early 19th century was a very dark period in history. I mean, it's unique. You've got the Industrial Revolution, you've got the American Revolution, French Revolution, life or death struggle with France, culminated in Waterloo. You know, it was an authoritarian country then. Yeah. These weren't cuddly, you know, social democrats. These were, you know, Tories that justified the Piccadilly massacre. It was a different world. And democracy wasn't, you know, democracy was a very late development in all of that.
Isn't there an anecdote about the Duke of Wellington?
Isn't there what?
An anecdote about the Duke of Wellington one night heard a crash of the street. I think it was just two horses or something, that said the revolution's broken out.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Sounds right.
Well, you've done
talking to this sort of...
No. Oh, okay. I just wondered, you know, you talked about Chartists. How are they different from the labour movement? Were they sort of more academic or...?
No, they were very much focused on the right to vote.
Oh, I see.
I mean, many of them were involved in the labour movement at that time through trade societies and the other, you know, anti-factory movements. There were Owenites, supporters of Robert Owens, and so forth. So they went right across, you know, supporters of working class education through mechanics institutes and so forth. And it culminated in an actual document, the People's Charter, that laid out the 6 points that they thought was going to establish democracy or male democracy in this country, and the other economic reforms could come from that. That's how you define it.
Nick, that was really so interesting as an archaeologist and attached to the Museum of Cambridge, which I'll talk to you about a little later. I love seeing the material culture. It was very male orientated, and it would be nice. It's nice to know that the next century, early 20th century, I suppose perhaps earlier, the suffragette movement also had their own objects.
Yeah.
And one of the things, even if you don't know very much about them, it shows you how having an object which defines you as a little icon makes everything so memorable.
Yes. Yeah, Martin writes a lot about that sort of thing. There's also in the book important suffrage banners, and there's a very interesting membership emblem of a female lodge of Robert Owen's Grand National, which is in a private collection, but again is a unique survival of that. Look at the book, buy the book.
Didn't he go to America to set up
Beg pardon?
Robert Owen?
Yes, he did. He set up his colonies in America as well. Yes, he was involved in that. No.
Nick, a bit of a left field question, and it's not about material culture, but I was wondering about the music that would have gone with all the marches and the demonstrations.
Good question.
Do we know anything about it?
Yes, there's a guy called Paul Pickering who's written several things about it. There were adaptations of existing tunes. There was God Bless Great Thomas Paine to the tune of God Save the King. The Marseillaise was used in a widespread way as a revolutionary anthem. I'm just trying to think Peterloo gave rise to various things, but you can Google Paul Pickering and find out what, he's done a lot of work on all that.
And of course the chants, the chants would have been things like, what do we want, when do we want it?
Yes, I'm not. Yes, and also they were big on disapprobation. After Peterloo, the marches then were kind of boo at magistrates' houses and things like this. They were very big on criticising the opposition.
And just to mention the banners, those flimsy ones that broke apart, they would have been a lot easier to sort of manage nowadays. Those huge Union banners, I carried one once, and they're making them in plastic now, PVC.
Yes.
And sometimes they make them so long that you've got to lean like this to stretch them out.
Yes. Yes.
So I think I would have preferred the flimsy ones.
Well, and branches vied with each other to have the biggest banner, and you find that in particular with the miners. It's all lost now, isn't it? But the Durham Gala and things like this, the people who carried the banners were paid to do that. They were paid a shift to do it, and you needed 6 men, no women, because there'd be people on the poles and people holding guide ropes to keep the...
Nobody ever told me about guide ropes.
No.
Thank you very much, Nick. Here's your bottle of wine.
Mm. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.